As a child, our home resembled a military camp. My father, a college teacher, ran our lives with strict rules and high expectations. In his eyes, my older sister Sophia was the perfect child. She was obedient, focused on her studies, and always tried to keep everyone happy. I was the opposite, always pushing the boundaries. During dinner, my father would snap. "Grace sits up straight. A lady doesn't slouch." I'd roll my eyes, sit up briefly, then slouch again as soon as he looked away. It was a constant battle of wills between us. Although my mother didn't speak much, her quiet disapproval was just as strong. She'd raise an eyebrow at my clothes or the friends I chose. Despite feeling constrained at home, I tried to become more independent. When I was 15, I started dating Michael. He was a college student, 16 years old, and everything my parents would have wished me to be. We held our meetings in secret whenever feasible. Like my own tiny retreat, it was a little moment of freedom in an otherwise structured life. I wanted to go to college, get away from my parents' rigorous control, and start living my life the way I wanted. But the outcome wasn't what was anticipated. A few months after I became 17 years old, I started feeling queasy every morning. The ailment lingered even after I initially wrote it off as exam-related stress. I remember shaking my hands as I looked at a pregnancy test in a gas station restroom, and a single pink line emerged. Positively, my heart dropped. I had a baby on the way. The next few days were vague. My mind was racing. There was nothing else that came to me, but I knew I had to tell Michael. But every time I tried to reach him on the phone, I was too afraid. Eventually, there were no more options for me to avoid it. We gathered in a quiet park where no one would notice, as is our routine. When he spotted me, he smiled, but his expression altered when he saw my face. "What's wrong?" he asked, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, wrapping my arms around myself and trying to speak steadily. "I have a child on the way." Without thinking, I spoke. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face showed a variety of emotions, such as amazement, confusion, and fear. "Are you sure?" he asked, in his voice. Not even a murmur. I nodded tearfully. "Come to the surface." My results from all 6 tests were positive. Michael brushed his fingers through his hair, avoiding eye contact with me. Finally, he murmured, "You have to throw it away. Grace, the only option is to undergo an abortion. We aren't mature enough. It'll ruin everything." I was surprised. I believed I loved this boy, but he treated our child as if it didn't exist. "Get out of my sight," I said. I could hardly contain my anger. He left without saying anything more, leaving me to face the hardest choice of my life. Telling my parents was even worse. I waited until after dinner. While my father read the newspaper, my mother crocheted in the living room. Sophia was standing nearby, her face reserved but curious. "I have something I would want to share with you." When I talked, I began to shake. The paper lowered my father's suspicions, which he already had. "What is it, Grace?" he asked, taking a long breath. I declared, "I'm pregnant." As the room exploded, my father's face turned scarlet, and he started yelling about shame and disappointment. My mother burst into tears and muttered something about what the neighbors may think. With a look of surprise and sorrow on her face, Sophia stood still. When he was sufficiently calm to talk, my father firmly stated, "You'll get an abortion. We'll find a secret clinic so that no one will ever know about this mistake." At first, I complained because I didn't want to do the assignment, but I couldn't handle the stress. A few days later, I was standing in a doctor's office with Sophia and my mother. Their faces are blank and rigid. After looking over my paperwork, the doctor, a kind woman in her 50s, turned to me and scowled. Her gaze became anxious. "Grace," she whispered back, "I have an important thing to inform you of in light of your medical history. If you choose to have an abortion, the chances of you never becoming pregnant again are extremely high." Her words hit me like a tsunami. Upon realizing that I would never be able to conceive again, I inhaled deeply. "I'm not doing it," I answered, sounding more composed than I had expected. I get to keep the baby. My mother gasped in shock as Sophia rolled her eyes, but I didn't waver. During the nervous, quiet journey home, I felt as though a weight was bearing down on me. When we arrived, my father was there, obviously eager to hear some news. However, he insisted on continuing to look at me. She wouldn't do it. My mother spat out her voice in frustration. After everything we had done for her, my father's face contorted in anger. He took a deep breath and then spoke in a firm, commanding voice. Get out. Gather your things and leave this place. I don't consider you my daughter. I won't let this family be embarrassed by your predicament. My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes fierce and merciless. You heard your father leave. Standing there, Sophia continued to be silently critical. Tears were flowing down my face as I rushed to my room and packed whatever I could fit in a suitcase. As I walked to the door, I heard my father's voice one last time, a somber reminder of his decision. You are dead in our eyes, so don't think about coming back. It was terrible to hear the door slam behind me. Finally, poor, pregnant, and all by herself. I had no one else to turn to but myself. The only person I thought could be helpful was my Aunt Harper, so I frantically called her. She and my Uncle Thomas had always been the family outsiders because they lived in a different state and didn't talk to my parents very much. My dears, what's wrong, Grace? Aunt Harper's kind, familiar voice comforted me through my feelings. I explained everything. When I finished, there was a long pause. Finally, she asked, Where are you now? Her house is not where I am. I spoke in a tremulous voice. They kicked me out. Another quiet. Then she gave the strong order, remain there. We're en route to pick you up. The long trip to Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas's house gave me plenty of time to process all that had happened. When we arrived at their cozy, modest home, it felt like a haven. Aunt Harper fussed over me and made sure I had food while Uncle Thomas carried my belongings to a spare room that was now mine. Putting the luggage down, he looked around the small, comfortable room and continued, It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it. I got a lump in my throat. It's perfect. The next several weeks, I murmured, were devoted to doctor's appointments and conversations about my future and adjusting to my new life. One evening at dinner, Aunt Harper spoke out, and since we think she was the first, we would like to help you continue your education. I looked up with surprise. What do you say? Uncle Thomas leaned closer, his expression friendly. We've saved some money throughout the years because we didn't have kids. Our goal is to help you pay for college. I couldn't believe what had happened after everything. Going to college seemed like an impossible dream. I can't think of anything to say. I faltered. Yes, Aunt Harper answered with a smile. You have our faith, Grace. This baby doesn't have to put a stop to your dreams. With their assistance. When I enrolled at a local community college, I decided to study business management. I persevered despite the challenges of balancing doctor's appointments, school, and pregnancy. I also found a job as a waiter at a local restaurant, the owner. Evelyn was a kind woman who understood my situation and offered me flexible hours. Although it wasn't much, it helped me save money for the baby and assisted Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas around the house. Birthing my son was the best and worst day of my life. After working for a few hours, I held him in my arms, admiring his tiny fingers and toes. Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas stood nearby, smiling like proud parents. You want to call him what? Aunt Harper asks awfully. My son was sleeping soundly as I looked down at him. David. I said that I know that God is my judge, regardless of what other people think. I made the proper choice as I adjusted to fatherhood and juggled work and college coursework. I would occasionally think of my parents and Sophia. Did they know who David was? I didn't care if they felt awful about what they had done. I had discovered a new family that loved me unconditionally and accepted me for who I was. One day, during a rare quiet, I found myself with a sense of optimism about the future I was building for myself. I stumbled onto a post from Sophia while perusing social media. My heart skipped a beat as I read that. Asterisk is overjoyed to announce that Michael and I are engaged. I can't wait to start our life together, asterisk. In the photo, Sophia was smiling and putting her arm around Michael, the same Michael who had carelessly abandoned our child and me. They seemed so happy as if nothing had ever happened before. Among the feelings that overcame me were anger, hurt, and betrayal. However, I came to a realization when I saw David playing happily in his crib. I didn't need their approval or love. Everything I truly wanted was right here with David. The hectic years included late-night study sessions, textbooks, and diapers. The final semester of college was challenging for me. To graduate on time, I continued to work at the restaurant, attend extra lessons, and look after a lively 5-year-old. On the day of graduation, emotions were running high. To receive my diploma, I had to wait in line. As I glanced around the throng, Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas were beaming with joy. David sat on Uncle Thomas's shoulders and would wave whenever he spotted me. Later at the graduation ceremony, Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas had made plans. My boss at Grace Diner, Evelyn, pulled me aside. She began with a smile. "I want to offer you something. I'm searching for someone new because you seem like the perfect fit for the restaurant manager post." I was surprised, but all I've done is work as a waitress, I murmured, almost incredulous. Evelyn waved her hand dismissively and remarked, "You've been so much more than that. I've observed how you handle difficult clients, oversee the workforce, and balance work, education, and motherhood, all of which are exactly the abilities and dedication I seek in a manager." It felt like a dream come true to have a steady job with better hours and pay. David and I had the ideal opportunity to begin a better new life. In the years that followed, life seemed to settle into a rhythm of positive development. I threw myself into learning as much as possible about management and business in my new role at the restaurant. After starting school, David grew into a bright, curious child who loved reading and baseball. At one of Andrew's Little League games, I got to know him. He was accompanied by his son, Kevin, who was a member of the opposing team, and we started talking. I was drawn to his soft eyes and easy laugh. "Dad doesn't have a partner?" I asked, noticing that he was alone himself. He nodded, his smile tinged with regret. Window Kevin's mother passed away when he was just a baby. I was heartbroken for him. I am aware that it must be challenging. "It is," he murmured. "But we do manage." "What about you? A mother without a partner?" I chuckled. "Is it truly that obvious?" Our bond developed gradually. We were both cautious since we had been hurt in the past and had children to consider. After some time spent together, I began to develop feelings for Andrew. He was kind and patient, which is why David adored him. About a year after we initially met, Andrew asked us to marry him. Our boys were playing close by, and it was a straightforward, serene moment on his lawn. Our wedding was small and intimate. There were only close friends and family. As I came down the aisle with David proudly beside me as the ring bearer, Aunt Harper gave me a look. She smiled brightly despite the tears in her eyes. The life of Andrew. David and Kevin quickly established a comforting study schedule. A few years after our wedding, we welcomed a new family member. Our daughter. When Zoe was born, Andrew and I were holding her in our arms on a beautiful spring morning. David sat around with Kevin. I had never before felt such a sense of completeness. All 3 of my children were very dear to me. David and Zoe, my biological children, and Kevin, my stepson. Blood didn't matter. They were all my children. One evening, we heard a familiar voice on TV while we were there assisting Aunt Harper with the children. When we turned around, we saw my parents on a local news program, appearing larger than life. My father stood at a podium and waved to the cheering crowd. At the bottom of the screen, the asterisk indicates that Adam Johnson is running for mayor. My heart nearly stopped. Unless it was on TV, I hadn't seen my parents in years. Harper's voice trembled as her face twisted in anger as her father spoke about moral integrity and family values. My dad looked older, his hair grayer, but his eyes still had that tough, resolute look I knew all too well. When I looked at Aunt Harper, she was shocked. She took a deep breath, her gaze still focused on the TV. "You must know something, Grace, something they have kept hidden for years." "What do you say?" I asked, bewildered. Then she told me something that caught me off guard. Many years ago, before Sophia and I were born, my parents had a child with serious physical issues. He was born without legs. Instead of assisting and caring for him, they left him at the hospital because they were too afraid of the disgrace he would cause. A whirlwind of emotions hit me. Shock, astonishment, and a lot of grief for the brother. I didn't know. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" As I breathed my words into Aunt Harper's, tears filled my eyes. "I'm very sorry, Grace, I should have. But after the way your parents have treated you, I didn't want to worsen your situation." That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I made up my mind. I needed to find my brother. With Andrew's assistance, we hired a private investigator. We finally got a lead after a few weeks. Despite everything, my brother was still alive and had survived. He was a well-known author, married, and had his kids. He had been adopted by a loving family who had given him every opportunity to succeed. Meeting him for the first time was surreal. I could see parts of myself in his face despite his unique features. His name was Robert, and he greeted me with a broad smile and wide arms. "I just never thought I'd discover a sister," he said quietly. "I always knew I had a biological family out there somewhere." Within the ensuing months, Robert and I grew close. I introduced him to my family, and he welcomed us into his. His wife, Julia, whose name made us giggle at the resemblance, and their 2 children quickly joined our extended family. Years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow. David, my eldest child, had recently turned 18 and secured a collegiate baseball scholarship. I was incredibly proud of the man he was becoming. Then one quiet Tuesday afternoon, while perusing news headlines, I spotted a familiar face. Even though my father was older, he still had the same air of dominance. It is stated in the headline, "Adam Johnson, the mayor of Asterisk, discusses family values in an exclusive interview." My asterisk curiosity overcame me, and I spent a few minutes watching the movie. I heard my father talk about the importance of family and moral values. Then the interviewer asked him about his children. As I expected, my father's expression of public sympathy softened. "I have a daughter named Sophia," he remarked. "She makes our lives better. Unfortunately, 2 of our kids died. The sadness never goes away, but it has made our family stronger." I was overwhelmed with mute rage for days. How could they pretend to be sympathetic, tragic individuals and erase Robert and me? Before fate stepped in, I appeared to be stewing in my anger. Robert called me one evening and told me that I would be signing books in our hometown the next week. It would mean the world to me. "Come, please." I wouldn't miss it for anything. I informed him that I was working on a plan. The following week, I returned to the city where I grew up. As I walked down the streets I knew so well, memories flooded back, some of them lovely, some of them horrific. I choose to ignore them and focus on the task at hand. The book signing took place in the huge ballroom of the city's most famous hotel. When I walked in, I recognized that Robert had not been exaggerating. In addition to my parents, it seemed like half the towns were there, along with prominent local figures, journalists, and celebrities. Robert took the stage and spoke passionately about his life, his journey, and the book that brought him to this point. When questions could be raised, I couldn't help myself pounding. I lifted my hand and stood up when Robert called on me. "In the beginning, Robert, I was straightforward. What does it feel like to know that your biological family, the ones who left you at birth, are now present in this room and witnessing your achievement beyond their wildest dreams?" Everyone turned to look at my parents, their expressions ranging from astonishment to curiosity, and the room fell silent. My father's face turned white, while my mother stayed off the steps and looked down. Robert didn't take it easy. He looked at my parents for a moment before beaming at me and said, "I'm thankful that I found my sister and that I have a family that loves and accepts me without conditions. Some people lose their way in life, while others find family in unexpected places." It was so silent. My father abruptly got up and rushed out, with my mother trailing closely behind. Her face flushed with embarrassment. As they left, I felt a deep sense of peace, as if I had finally closed a challenging chapter. Robert, his family, and I spent the rest of that night celebrating his victory with the individuals who had become my true family. It had been years since I'd felt truly free. I could finally let go of the baggage of my past, enjoy the life I had built, and treasure the family I had met. As the celebration began, business executives and politicians mingled in the lavish ballroom. My parents were seated in the first row, and my father, who is now the mayor, looked at Sophia. He was every inch the eminent politician, with a smart suit and a strong stance. My mother was smiling and nodding at everyone she knew, and she was dressed nicely. Sitting beside them, Sophia gazed straight ahead. My heart was pounding so loudly that I believed everyone could hear me sitting in the back, but they hadn't noticed. Then Robert maneuvered his wheelchair onto the stage to deafening applause. He seemed calm, relaxed, and powerful in the spotlight. Robert's steady, friendly voice began to discuss his book and life narrative. As my parents explained that Robert was born with a severe disability, no legs, and other health issues, I listened carefully. He asserted that my biological parents abandoned me in the hospital because they were unable or unwilling to care for me. My father's face stayed practiced and unintelligible, as if he were merely listening to someone else's tale. "It's a tragic tale," she continued. "But I was lucky. I was adopted by a kind family that gave me every chance to succeed." He paused, then went on. "Still, I had always wanted to know who my birth family was and why they had abandoned me." Everyone in the room was deeply engaged in a story, and there was stillness. My pulse was pounding because I knew Robert was drawing nearer to the moment that would change everything. Then he smiled, humor and determination shining in his eyes. "However, my story doesn't stop there. You see, I found my family. My sister, Grace, is here today." He turned to me and extended his hand. "Grace, would you join me on stage?" The crowd let out a collective gasp. As I stepped into the spotlight, several people in the crowd knew me. The reactions in the front row were the most shocking, but then I had grown up in this town. My parents' faces went pale, and Sophia seemed to have seen a ghost. They knew that their carefully constructed image was beginning to fall apart. I wasn't going to let my parents get away with it this time, even if they were getting ready for a short vacation. "Parents, please stay." I called it out, and my voice reverberated around the now quiet room. "I think it's time to have a candid conversation. Don't you?" They froze while the entire audience watched them. Reluctantly, they took their seats again. I took a deep breath and looked at myself. I grew up with many of you. You are familiar with my family, although there are many. You didn't know a lot of things that have been kept under wraps for too long. I paused to gather my strength. I told them everything. For shame of Robert's disabilities, my parents left him at the hospital. I outlined how they targeted his life and created a phony public image before history was repeated. I continued to speak up more vehemently when I became pregnant at age 21, but they showed no compassion or understanding. Medical professionals insisted I have an abortion despite warnings that it could infertile me. They expelled me, left me pregnant, and then abandoned me when I refused, all to maintain their perfect image. Whispers and gasps erupted as the audience processed the weight of my words. My parents were being belittled and people were sitting more quietly. For years, my parents have talked to me about morals and family values. As I talked, my voice was trembling with passion, but their actions painted a different picture. They took us out of their lives and abandoned two of their children when we needed them most to preserve their perfect image. The room descended into chaos. I heard shouting at my parents and heated arguments. As the situation unfolded, reporters who had expected a simple book signing were frantically taking notes, speaking into their phones, or pointing cameras at it. In the middle of the chaos, I looked directly into my father's eyes. The man who seemed so resilient and strong in my early years suddenly looked weak, broken, and defeated. With an expression of remorse and guilt on her face, my mother sobbed uncontrollably as she sat next to him. Sophia sat motionless, her face a mask of surprise and confusion. In the days that followed, word of the catastrophe spread quickly. My disclosures, Robert's story, and my parents' hypocrisy became embroiled in a neighborhood issue. My father's political career ended because people began to question his moral character. The image they had spent so much time and effort building was finally destroyed. In the meantime, I was accompanied by my family, whom I had carefully chosen and crafted. Robert and I grew closer, grateful for the chance to make up for lost time. I was always content with Andrew, David, Kevin, and little Zoe, and Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas were always there to encourage me. Despite everything, I was finally free of the weight of my past, able to live a life that was honest and unrestricted, and surrounded by a family that truly loved and accepted me. In the days that followed, the story took off. It garnered national attention from local news. My father, who had earned a living by promoting integrity and family values, was exposed as a hypocrite. Almost instantly, his political career collapsed, and he resigned within a week, citing fictitious personal reasons. After the college where he taught suddenly distanced itself, he was sacked. Sadly, one thing came out of all the chaos. My sister Sophia made her choice. She resolutely stood by our parents and refused to face reality. During a quick, panicked phone conversation, she said, "You've ruined everything. Don't ever contact me again. You're as dead to me as you are to Mom and Dad, but life has a way of taking us by surprise." 2 or 3 days later, I received a call from a number I hadn't seen in over 20 years. It was Michael, Sophia's current husband and the father of my oldest child. "Grace," he said in a hesitant, almost unsure voice. "I've been thinking back on what happened to us. I can't conceive with Sophia." I pondered. Well, we have a son together. We could end up as a family. I burst out laughing at the absurdity. "Michael, you made up your mind 20 years ago. When you left me, I was expecting your child. You were my sister's spouse. You now think that just because you can't have kids with her, you might come back to me. No, that isn't how it works. But Grace, please." He tried again. "No, Michael. My husband is amazing, and my family is beautiful. I don't need you, yet I don't want to say goodbye." I hung up, feeling. The surprises continued, even though I was unaware that I needed this unexpected sense of closure. The next day, I got another call, but it came from a number I didn't recognize. A timid, quiet voice answered my question. "This is Grace, Mia, and Michael's mother. Did we just find out about David, right? Do any of us have a grandson?" The conversation that followed was moving and illuminating. Mia says Michael and my parents had told them I had had an abortion and had been absent for years. Their grandchild had never been born, they believed. "We'd like to meet him." She continued in a trembling voice. "Of course! We would understand if you didn't want us in your lives, if that's okay with you." I briefly thought that Michael's parents were not to blame for either Michael's behavior or the lies my parents had told them. Had been tricked, too. "Okay," I replied. "Finally, I will ask David if he is open to meeting you." The encounter between David and his grandparents turned out to be quite good. There were hugs, tears, and a lot of catching up. David, who was always generous, greeted them with wide arms, and they embraced him with a joy they had been denied for so long. In the months that followed, life settled into a new, peaceful pattern. Robert and his family regularly became a part of our lives, adding laughter, love, and support. Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas lavished their grandchildren with love, regardless of their biological status, and made sure they all knew how much they were cherished. David gained a sense of belonging and family history from his adoptive grandparents' presence as well. Sophia is where my parents are. The only information I was given was that they were trying to flee the scene. I felt a little sorry for them, but I knew that telling the truth had been the right thing to do. For the first time, I felt freed from their expectations and the weight of their lives, finally able to move on from the painful past and be with my true family. I could now welcome a future full of love and honesty, because the family I had built was stronger and more authentic than any picture my parents had tried to convey.